This event took place in October 2017 at a secluded cabin in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. The cabin is part of a private retreat owned by my former university. There are roughly a dozen cabins on the land, each spaced apart for privacy. I've been visiting this retreat for nearly 25 years, and up until this particular trip, I had never experienced anything unusual or unexplained. It was just me and my 15-year-old son on this trip, his first time coming along. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin we reserved was a short walk from the main parking area, roughly a third of a mile. It sat in a quiet clearing surrounded by thick forest, with a narrow footpath leading past it towards the other cabins. The cabin itself was built simply from rough-hewn logs taken from the surrounding woods. A small porch wrapped around the front, bordered by a wooden railing, and against that railing was a woodpile rack, a small but important detail for later. Inside, the main room had a large stone fireplace with a raised hearth, a couple of worn-out couches, a dining table, and a compact kitchen setup. The only water supply came from a 10-gallon plastic container positioned next to a small sink embedded in the counter. The sleeping quarters were located in the back of the cabin, behind the fireplace. Each bedroom contained 2 single beds, one against each side of the wall, with a window positioned between them. After hauling in our supplies, we went outside to chop some firewood. As the cabin had no electricity or heating, only propane lanterns for light. After about 30 minutes of effort, we had split enough logs to keep a fire burning for a full day. Dusk was settling in as we stacked most of the wood inside, next to the fireplace, while the excess was stored on the porch's wood rack. That night, we ate a store-bought roasted turkey for dinner. I built up a fire in the hearth, adding logs until it produced a steady bed of glowing embers. We turned one of the couches to face the fire, sat together, and read, occasionally pausing to chat. It was peaceful. The only sound was the crackling of the flames, and the warmth was comforting. We slept soundly and woke refreshed the next morning. After a simple breakfast, we took a short hike around the property. I showed my son a few of the other cabins where I had stayed in years past. The weather was overcast, crisp, and breezy, a typical autumn day. We returned to the cabin around noon. I rekindled the fire while we made sandwiches for lunch. Again, we settled into the couch, enjoying the quiet, reading our books. Then the strange part of the story began. Out of nowhere, a noise came from outside, behind us. To me, it sounded like a heavy log shifting on the woodpile out on the porch. Imagine the deep, hollow thud a thick, round log makes when it rolls against others. My son and I exchanged startled glances. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied, but he pointed towards the back of the cabin, which was strange because I was certain the noise had come from the porch at the front. I assumed it was just how sound carried through the cabin's structure. My immediate thought was that some kids from a nearby cabin were messing around. The footpath was close by, after all. Maybe someone had wandered past and decided to play a prank. We both stood. I glanced out the window facing the path but saw no one. When I turned to my son, I noticed unease written on his face. "I'm going to check outside," I told him. For good measure, I grabbed a long, sturdy split log from the hearth, something light enough to swing if needed but solid enough to defend myself. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind me. I took 2 steps forward and stopped. Looking left, I saw nothing but tall grass and dense trees. Turning right, toward the woodpile, I saw something that would change my life forever. It happened in mere seconds. Hovering just above the stack of wood was something. It's difficult to describe, but the closest thing I can compare it to is an octopus's tentacle, but one made of some strange, shimmering, semi-transparent material. It had a rough, bark-like texture on top, speckled with white patches, while the underside was a pale, glowing white. It didn't look solid. It seemed to pulse slightly, like it wasn't entirely in this world. The moment I laid eyes on it, the thing recoiled, whipping around the side of the cabin in a flash, almost as if it knew I had seen it and was retreating. I had always thought those stories about people freezing in fear were exaggerated, but I suddenly understood. I could not move. It was as if my body was disconnected from my brain. I wanted to chase after it, to see where it had gone, but I physically could not make myself take a step. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, I forced myself to turn and go back inside. My son stood there, his face anxious. "You saw something," he said, reading my expression. I nodded. "Yeah, I did." His eyes widened. "What was it?" I hesitated, tapping the log against my leg, trying to sound casual so he wouldn't panic. "I'm not sure. Let me check around the cabin." I stepped back outside and cautiously walked around the structure. I peered around the porch's side, nothing. But I did notice something odd. Beneath the woodpile, the ground was covered with dry twigs and leaves. If anyone or anything had been standing there, I would have heard them breaking underfoot. But I had heard nothing. There were no footprints, no signs of anything having been disturbed. I went back inside and told my son, "Nothing's there." He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely comforted. As night fell, we made dinner, but another odd thing happened. While preparing food, I noticed a large puddle of water on the counter next to the sink, far from the water container. Confused, I wiped it up, but then I discovered that the dry goods on the small table were all soaked too, with another puddle beneath them. There was no plumbing in the cabin, no leaks in the ceiling, no rain, no explanation. Twice I cleaned up the mysterious water, and both times it reappeared. That night, I barricaded the door with a metal folding chair, just in case. As I lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, I was awakened by a noise. A scratching sound outside, near my son's side of the room. The sound grew louder, moving along the outer wall toward me. It wasn't a normal scratching. It was deep, metallic, like something sharp dragging against wood. Then it reached the wall directly behind me and stopped. I lay frozen, heart pounding. I whispered a desperate prayer, too afraid to move. After what felt like an eternity, the sound never returned. In the morning, my son hadn't heard a thing. We packed up and left. On the way out, I asked the retreat manager if there had ever been reports of anything strange in that cabin. He shook his head. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know it was real. My son was there. I was clear-headed. I've never touched a drop of alcohol or taken any substances that could explain hallucinations. I haven't returned to that cabin since, but part of me wants to go back, just to see if it happens again. My fiancée, Sarah, and I were about 17 hours into our road trip to her family's remote cottage in Upper Michigan for a short getaway. I glanced over at her as she slept soundly in the passenger seat, my eyelids growing heavy. The last leg of the drive took us down winding, deserted back roads through tiny towns with barely a few hundred people and a single traffic light. The solitude grew stronger as street names gave way to numbered signs. At last, I turned onto the long stretch of road that snaked through a dense forest, leading to the cabin. My GPS chirped that we had about 2 miles left, then silence returned. The car crawled over the rough, underdeveloped road, the tires crunching over loose gravel while towering evergreens blotted out the night sky. By the time we arrived, I was so exhausted that sleeping in the car seemed like a viable option. I had never been here before, but at first glance, the place felt cozy, nothing extravagant, just a simple 3-bedroom cabin near a quiet, 900-acre lake. We unpacked hastily and collapsed onto a musty-smelling bed. Even though we were drained, we were eager to unwind and disconnect. When sunlight flooded our room the next morning, I felt an odd sense of peace. Out of habit, I checked my phone and was relieved to see there was no signal. No one could reach us even if they wanted to. Sarah volunteered to drive to the nearest town to pick up groceries while I explored the cabin. I sifted through a collection of aged books on the shelves and examined a stack of classic board games, already picturing our plans for the next few days. Stepping outside, I walked down to the dock, where a small boat bobbed gently in the water. The planks groaned under my feet as I looked out over the lake, a sense of calm washing over me. Since Sarah's trip would take about an hour, I decided to do some fishing. As I cast my line, My eyes were drawn to a small island near the center of the lake. It was no more than a few 100 feet across, dense with trees and thick underbrush. Something about it pulled at me. It had an almost otherworldly presence. I anchored the boat about 50 feet from shore and started fishing. Within moments, I felt a tug, but as I reeled it in, something struck the boat. At first, I figured I had lost the fish, but when I lifted the line, I saw it dangling. A fish, but mangled, torn apart in a way I couldn't explain. A bigger fish must have attacked it, I thought, but there had been no struggle. I dismissed it as a fluke and cast again. But it happened again. Each fish I pulled in looked similarly shredded. After the fourth or fifth time, I found myself glancing uneasily toward the island. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Unease settled in my stomach, and I slowly paddled back to shore, avoiding looking at the island again. Later, over dinner, I casually brought up the island. I noticed there's an island in the middle of the lake. Ever been there? I asked. Sarah shook her head. Oh, that? My dad always told us to stay away. Said the land was still owned by the family of some woman who used to live there. Wait, someone lived there? Yeah, she ran an old antique shop in town. She passed away about 50 years ago. Had to row to shore every morning just to get to her car, she explained. I chuckled. Must have been a nightmare just to get groceries. Sarah nodded, but her tone turned somber. My dad said she was strange. Sometimes they'd see her just standing at the shore, staring at them while they fished. That night, I lay in bed, unable to stop thinking about the island. Curiosity gnawed at me. If there really was a house there, abandoned for half a century, I needed to see it for myself. Sarah would never agree to come. She hated anything remotely creepy, but I couldn't let it go. Once she was asleep, I grabbed my flashlight, a hunting knife just in case, and my phone to record any discoveries. I slipped outside, the world unnervingly silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. As I paddled toward the island, each splash of the oars echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Circling the shoreline, I searched for a place to dock. Finally, I found an old, half-submerged stump and tied the boat to it. I pushed through the thick brush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, until I stumbled onto what must have once been a yard. And there it was, a 2-story house, decaying and half-swallowed by the wilderness. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in, and ivy strangled its walls. I pulled out my phone and hit record as I stepped toward the entrance. Inside, time had stopped. Dust-covered trinkets, broken furniture, and forgotten belongings were strewn across the floor. A rusty box spring lay collapsed against a wall. Then, my light caught a pile of baby dolls stacked haphazardly in the corner. Some were missing limbs, others were headless. Above them, a framed photograph hung crookedly. I wiped away the dust and coughed as it clouded the air. A woman stood in front of this very house, a baby in her arms, 2 little boys at her sides. None of them smiled. Then I saw him. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8, stood in the doorway. He had sandy blonde hair, deep brown eyes that stared right through me. "What are you doing here, sir?" he asked, his voice sending a chill through me. I was frozen. "Can you help my brother?" he pleaded before turning and darting into another room. My heart pounded. My brain screamed at me to run. But I had this all on video, I had proof. I stepped inside the room after him and found myself in a completely different setting. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine, as if frozen in time. A baby lay swaddled on a couch, eerily still. Another child rocked in the corner, mumbling. Then, from upstairs, I heard it. A woman crying. The whimpering escalated into wailing. Footsteps pounded on the floor above, thudding toward the staircase. "Leave. She doesn't like visitors," the boy whispered. The room decayed around me in an instant, darkness swallowing the pristine illusion. The footsteps stopped. The wailing stopped. Then the thing came for me. A towering, shadowy figure with tangled hair and elongated limbs emerged from the darkness. It sobbed into its hands before letting out an ear-piercing scream. I ran. Something slammed into me, sending me sprawling. My flashlight rolled away, casting its beam toward the creature as it loomed over me. With terrifying strength, it pinned me, guiding my own knife toward my stomach. In a last desperate act, I grabbed a shard of glass and drove it into its eye. I don't remember making it back to the boat. I don't remember reaching the cabin. But when I stumbled inside, I heard the crying again, inside our bedroom. When I opened the door, it stopped. Sarah lay there, undisturbed. The next morning, I forced her awake. "We're leaving. Now." I never looked back. It was the middle of winter, sometime in early January, right after the holiday season. This time of year, we usually got a fair amount of snow. My two cousins and I decided to take a trip and spend the weekend at a remote cabin. A relative of ours owned a cabin near the mountains, and we thought it would be the perfect getaway. We planned to head up on Thursday night and return by Saturday morning. The family who owned the place had warned us about odd occurrences and strange sightings around the cabin. They said their young son had once stood at the kitchen window, pointing outside. When his mother asked what was wrong, he told her there was a lady standing in the yard. But when she looked, no one was there. The three of us were skeptical and decided to go anyway. If the worst thing we encountered was a mysterious woman outside, we figured it wasn't a big deal. A winter storm had been forecasted, but all of us had four-wheel drive vehicles and were used to driving in snowy conditions. Nothing was going to stop us from enjoying a relaxing weekend at the cabin. With our bags packed and enough food and drinks to last the weekend, we set off. When we finally arrived, light snow had started to fall, which only made the setting feel cozier. There was plenty of firewood for the fireplace, and we had remembered to bring hot chocolate and coffee. Once we got settled in, we built a fire and relaxed. The wind outside had picked up, and the snow was quickly piling up. Figuring this was as bad as the storm would get, we spent the evening talking and laughing, enjoying each other's company. After several hours, we all decided to turn in for the night. I slept better than I had in a long time. There's something about being in a cabin that just makes sleep feel deeper and more peaceful. The next morning, I woke up to the delicious smell of breakfast. The scent of bacon, eggs, and sausage was so strong, I could almost hear them sizzling in the pan. I rolled out of bed, eager to grab a cup of coffee and see if whoever was cooking needed help. As I stepped into the hallway, I ran into my cousin. Let's call him Jake. "Man, I'm starving," Jake said. "The kitchen smells amazing." But when we walked into the kitchen, it was empty. There was no food cooking, no frying pans in use. The stove was off, and it looked like nothing had been touched. We exchanged confused looks before brushing it off as one of the strange things people had mentioned about the cabin. "Well," Jake joked, "if there's a ghost here, I sure wish it had actually made us breakfast." We laughed and agreed not to mention it to anyone, knowing they'd just think we were making up a ghost story. Just then, the front door swung open, and in came our other cousin. We'll call him Mark. "It's turning into a full-on blizzard out there," Mark said. "We should probably start our trucks and make sure the batteries don't die. If the storm gets worse, we might have to leave sooner." We had come in 3 separate trucks, all with four-wheel drive, and none of them had ever given us trouble before. The 3 of us grabbed our keys and went outside. I climbed into my truck and turned the key. The engine clicked but wouldn't start. I looked over and saw Jake and Mark struggling with their ignitions as well. One by one, the engines gave out until all 3 trucks were silent. After checking everything and finding nothing wrong, frustration set in. With no way to leave, we headed back inside. There was a landline phone in the cabin, so we tried calling a friend to see if they could come pick us up. But when we lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone. "What do we do now?" Jake asked. "Well," I replied, "first thing we need to do is keep the fire going." Mark volunteered to go outside and bring in more firewood from the shed. A few minutes later, he came rushing back inside. "Hey, I think we have neighbors." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" I was at the woodshed when I heard someone giggle. I turned around and saw a woman walking through the snow. She looked back at me, then disappeared behind the shed. Curious, we all went outside to see where she had gone. But when we got to the area Mark had pointed out, there were no footprints in the snow. By this point, the snow was at least 5 inches deep. There was no way someone could have walked through it without leaving tracks. We all chuckled nervously and teased Mark about imagining things, but deep down, we were all starting to feel uneasy. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and we went to bed hoping that by morning, things would be back to normal. But when I woke up, the scent of breakfast filled the air once again. Just like the day before, the kitchen was empty. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat in the living room, waiting for the others to wake up. Jake and Mark soon joined me. "Still nothing?" Jake asked. I shook my head. "Trucks still won't start," Mark added. We spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. People knew we were up here, so if we didn't return by Sunday, someone would come looking for us. That night, as we sat by the fireplace, we heard the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the kitchen. I stood up and walked toward the noise, but the kitchen was empty. At this point, we were all feeling unsettled. We decided to try and get some rest, hoping things would be better by morning. Sunday morning came, and once again, I woke up to the mouth-watering smell of breakfast. By now, I knew what to expect: the empty kitchen. This time, we didn't even mention it. "Let's try the trucks," Jake suggested. We grabbed our keys and went outside, not expecting much. I put my key in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. I looked over and saw Jake and Mark's trucks start up as well. We all stared at each other in disbelief. For 2 days, the trucks had refused to start, and now, out of nowhere, they were running perfectly. We didn't waste any time. Without even turning the engines off, we ran back inside and hurriedly packed our things, tossing everything into our trucks without any care for organization. We just wanted to get out of there. As I loaded the last of my things, I heard Mark mutter, "Look at the window." I turned to see what he was talking about. In the kitchen window, staring out at us, was a woman. She had long brown hair and was wearing what looked like a nightgown. She was beautiful, and she was waving at us. That was all we needed. We jumped into our trucks and sped down the mountain, not once looking back. To this day, we still don't know what happened. Why did all 3 trucks suddenly stop working, only to start up again exactly when we needed to leave? And who was that woman? Some people believe our story, others think we made it up. When we told the cabin's owners about the woman, they simply nodded. "Yeah," they said, "she's there pretty often." The cabin was eventually sold and later burned down. But as for whatever still lingers on that land, I don't think I want to find out. Here are some older tales about cabins that many may not have heard before. Enjoy one of Grandpa's eerie legends. The hunting shack looked exactly how I remembered it. Small, barely larger than a storage shed, and after years of abandonment, dust covered everything inside. I hadn't stepped foot here in nearly a decade. The last time was when I went hunting with my grandfather, Ernest. What I saw in the forest back then had shaken me so much that I never wanted to return. My parents assumed I just found it dull to spend 2 weeks with an old man in the middle of nowhere, but my cousin Leo still went to visit him. Thankfully, we never had to go back. When Grandpa passed away a year ago, he left me the cabin and the 30 acres of land surrounding it. At 21, I never thought I'd come back to this remote hillside, let alone own the place. But after a rough breakup, my choices were limited: move here or crash in my parents' basement. The decision was almost tough. The local newspaper, the Pinewood Gazette, reported that Grandpa had been killed by a bear while chopping wood behind the cabin. I didn't buy that story, and even as I pulled my battered old truck into the dirt driveway, my hand was already on my shotgun. Not that I thought it would do much if that thing was still out there, but having it gave me some comfort. I spent hours tidying up, and by evening, the place was livable again. Utilities were still running, and the fridge was stocked. Leo had been by recently. I took the week off work to settle in, planning to just relax for a while. The first night was uneventful. The second night, however, things started to feel off. Growing up in the countryside, I knew the local wildlife, raccoons, foxes, even the occasional bear. But the fresh claw marks on the cabin walls? I had never seen anything like them. On the third morning, I woke to find deep gouges in the wood. They were too big for any small animal and too high up for coyotes. Even mountain lions or bears didn't seem to fit. There was no logical explanation. As I ran my fingers along the fresh marks, I wondered how I had slept through something like this happening right outside my door. A person could have made them with a knife, I supposed, but there were no neighbors for miles. Who would trek all the way out here just to mess with me? The thought crossed my mind that my ex, Melissa, might have done it to freak me out, but she lived nearly 50 miles away and didn't even know where the cabin was. I pushed the thought aside, figuring there was no point in stressing over it. Still, that afternoon, I drove the 10 miles into town and bought motion-activated floodlights and a security camera. For 2 more nights, I woke up to find new claw marks creeping closer and closer to the door. As much as I wanted to believe it was just a prank, I knew deep down that wasn't the case. The floodlights would flash and the camera would snap pictures, but the images always showed an empty yard. I even set my phone to record video, but all I caught was a blur of movement at the edge of the screen. By the 5th night, I'd had enough. I sat outside, shotgun in hand, waiting on the porch steps. The night was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Hours passed, and just after midnight, I nearly dozed off before a sound pulled me back to alertness. Something was moving at the tree line. I peered into the darkness, and my breath hitched. It was Grandpa Ernest. He wasn't wearing a stitch of clothing. He froze mid-step, his head turning toward me slowly, as if he had just realized I was there. His skin was pale, his ribs protruding. The thick white beard and bushy hair he used to have were gone. He was completely bald. "Grandpa!" My voice trembled, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the shotgun. Tears welled in my eyes. I had been so sure I would see that thing from all those years ago, the creature that had killed him. But here he was, standing right in front of me. "Grandpa, come inside." I didn't care where he had been or what had happened. I only cared that he was alive. "Run, boy. Get out of here. It's coming." His voice was wrong, raspy and inhuman. Before I could react, Grandpa dropped onto all fours and bolted into the woods, vanishing like a ghost. The bushes barely rustled where he had passed through, as if he had never been there at all. Then I heard the growl. It came from behind me, low and guttural, reverberating against the cabin walls. A massive figure crept from the shadows, just as I remembered. Long, spindly limbs stretched from an impossibly thin torso. A deer skull gleamed under the slivers of moonlight filtering through the trees. It wore tattered buckskin leggings, beads hanging from its neck. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them locked onto me. My mind reeled. Was it a Wendigo? A skinwalker? Something else entirely? I barely had time to process before the thing let out a distorted, horrible laugh. A sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. It laughed so hard its skeletal body nearly bent in half, its elongated arms coiling around itself like a snake. I raised my shotgun and fired. Shells tore into its chest and neck, but the creature merely looked down at the wounds. One by one, it plucked the bullets from its flesh, dropping them onto the ground with an air of annoyance. Then it spoke. Inside, the word rang in my ears. My pulse pounded. I blinked, and suddenly, the creature was gone. Standing in its place was Rufus, Grandpa Ernest's old friend. Rufus had been around since I was a kid, always showing up unexpectedly. He supposedly lived on the far side of the mountain, though I had never seen his home, never even known exactly where he came from. "What the hell are you doing out here, boy?" Rufus barked. I was shaking so badly I could barely move, but somehow, I made it up the porch steps. I didn't question why I trusted Rufus in that moment. Maybe because his familiar face grounded me, made this madness slightly more bearable. I needed something normal. So, like any other night, I locked the doors and windows. I took a long, hot shower, ignoring the insanity of what I had just witnessed. I climbed into bed, my heart still hammering, trying to convince myself that I would wake up and everything would be normal. Even now, writing this down, I don't understand what happened that night. I have more questions than ever. Who or what was Rufus? And what was that thing wearing my grandfather's face? A few years back, my family used to rent cabins near a large lake with my grandparents almost every summer. We would usually grill food, go swimming, and take pontoon boats out on the water to fish or just enjoy the scenery. Over time, this spot became a great escape from my hometown. When we first arrived at the cabin, I won't lie, it gave off a weird vibe. The people next door immediately got out of the pool as soon as we pulled up, and they just stood there staring at us for a bit. Jump ahead to the second night. My brother and I were both struggling to fall asleep, so we decided to sneak outside. We headed toward a small pond to smoke. What I didn't realize at the time was that my brother had taken painkillers earlier and passed out about 20 minutes later while we were on our phones. Being the reckless teenager I was, I took his share and wandered off, looking for a quiet spot. I ended up finding a stump that overlooked the lake, so I sat down, smoked, and admired how beautiful the moonlit night was. That's when I heard something strange from the other side of the pond. I turned my head and thought I saw movement, but I was definitely high, so I couldn't see clearly past the water. After staring for a bit, I saw a figure step forward, and my stomach dropped. A tall man stood there, his face shadowed under a hood. He was dressed entirely in black and must have been at least 6'7". My eyes drifted downward, and that's when I saw it. He was gripping a shovel. I froze. Then I realized something even worse. He was staring straight at me, and then, I swear, he suddenly started sprinting toward me at full speed. I panicked and bolted back toward the cabin. He was running insanely fast around the side of the pond, but I had a head start and was closer to the row of cabins. I made it to our driveway and crouched behind my car. Peeking out, I saw him about 20 yards away, scanning the area as if searching for me. As soon as he turned his back and disappeared behind a nearby building, I took my chance, slipping back inside the cabin and locking every door. I got into bed and tried to convince myself that nothing had happened. The rest of the trip went by as usual, but I couldn't shake that terrifying moment. I kept wondering, what had he been digging, and why did he suddenly charge at me like that? I'll never know for sure, but part of me believes I walked in on him burying something or someone. One thing's for sure, though, I never want to run into that terrifying giant in the woods again. When I was 15 years old, my girlfriend and I visited my grandparents' home. We came up with the idea of testing our bravery late at night, basically an excuse to go explore abandoned and eerie places. We asked my grandpa if he knew of any locations like that. He told us about an old, deserted house and cabin about a kilometer south of where we were. He mentioned that the house had belonged to a man from Indiana named Daniel Hayes back in the early 1900s. One day, he vanished without a trace and was never heard from again. We were skeptical of the story. My girlfriend and I weren't exactly believers in the supernatural, so we decided to check out the place ourselves. My grandparents weren't happy about it, but like typical teenagers, we didn't listen. We snuck out in the middle of the night, running off toward the south in search of the abandoned house and cabin. The only things we carried with us were 2 pocket knives, 2 flashlights, and some extra batteries. As we walked through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was as if the forest had eyes and ears, tracking our every move. When we finally found the house and the cabin, a sudden gust of cold wind hit us, sending chills down our spines. We entered the house first. Inside, we found unsettling things. Books about dark rituals and witchcraft, bizarre graffiti we couldn't understand, creepy paintings, and worst of all, dolls in every single room. The house itself was just a typical American home. That's the best way I can describe it since I'm from Thailand. We were uneasy but still determined to check out the cabin. So we left the house and carefully made our way toward it. It was about 50 or 60 feet from the house. As I walked behind my girlfriend, I suddenly heard a voice. "Over here. I'm here." I stopped in my tracks, scanning the area to see who had spoken. But all I saw was a small mound of concrete. Something pulled me toward it. I stepped closer. Then everything went black. Apparently, I blacked out. When I came to, I saw my girlfriend lying face down on the ground just outside the cabin. We had never actually reached it. Panicking, I rushed to her side. The moment she woke up, she let out a scream that made my heart stop. "Leave us alone." I stumbled backward, startled. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that a man had been following us the entire time. "What?" I looked at her face. She was pale as a ghost, sickly, like all the life had been drained out of her. At that point, we were terrified and knew we had to get out of there. I gave her a piggyback ride and carried her out of the forest as fast as I could. When we finally reached the dirt road near my grandparents' house, I set her down, and that's when I noticed something strange. No time had passed. We had left for the forest at exactly 11:38 p.m. We had wandered through it, found the house, lost consciousness, and rushed back. But when we looked at the time, it was only 11:39 p.m. Only a single minute had passed. Even though we had walked over a kilometer in and out, I immediately called my uncle to come pick us up. A few minutes later, he arrived, and we rushed my girlfriend to the nearest hospital. When I told him about what had happened, he was furious. He yelled that we were incredibly lucky to have made it back alive. He said that other people had gone to investigate that place before, but many of them returned injured. Unfortunately, my girlfriend ended up with a permanent scar on her head from whatever happened when we blacked out. After that night, we didn't do anything like that again for several years. Thankfully, we're both alive and well now. But one thing is for sure, we'll never go near another abandoned cabin again. To start, let me give you some background. My family was never particularly religious while I was growing up, even though we lived right in the heart of the South. In fact, the most religious thing we ever did was attend a well-known church in my city because my grandmother loved the spectacle of it, not necessarily because she was deeply devoted. I know that for sure now, but that entire situation is a different story. This all happened roughly 2 years before I sat down to write this, back before the world shut down. At the time, my mental health and my relationship with my parents were in a bad place. Constant arguments, emotional strain, just an overall toxic environment. On top of all that, a close friend of mine, someone I had even gone on a few dates with, tragically took his own life. The weight of grief was unbearable, and I felt completely drained. Not long after, the nightmares started, terrible ones. Though I can't always recall every detail, a few things remained the same. The setting would always begin to darken, as if a thick shadow was creeping in. Since my dreams were always in first person, it felt like the darkness was closing in on my own vision. Worse, the entire space would seem to get heavier, much like that moment in The Lord of the Rings when Gandalf scolds Bilbo and the room dims. But in my dream, it was more suffocating. Then, an awful coldness would well up in my stomach, along with an overwhelming sense of terror. Even if I couldn't see anything specific, my body would brace for something sinister. If there were people around before, they would either vanish or suddenly turn toward me, their faces completely void of expression. This happened every single time. Either they disappeared or they stared at me, lifeless. Finally, the worst part would come. A sensation would wash over me, something impossible to fight against. Have you ever had a limb fall asleep? That tingling sensation? Imagine that, but stronger, like being wrapped up in something massive and crushing. Sometimes, it would even center around my throat, as if I was being choked. Alongside the fear and darkness, there would also be an overwhelming static-like noise, almost like the combined sound of television static and cicadas screaming. It made it impossible to think, impossible to speak, and impossible to move. This would continue until, eventually, I managed to force myself awake. But even then, the terror didn't always end. If I tried to go back to sleep too soon, the nightmare would pick up exactly where it had left off. Fast forward to 2020. I cut ties with my parents and went through several rough living situations. Eventually, I moved in with my best friend, who had a small cabin out in the countryside. Let's call her Elle. She was deeply religious and one of the kindest people I had ever met. My bed was in the tiny loft area of her cabin, just a small twin mattress. One night, Elle was babysitting overnight for a friend, so I was alone in the cabin. It had been over a month since my last nightmare, so I didn't think much of it as I went to sleep. But this time, instead of easing into the dream, it was like jumping straight into an action scene without any warning. In the dream, I was stumbling out of the cabin, throwing myself into my car, and speeding down the dark country roads. I was barely able to control the vehicle, nearly flying off the road multiple times. Panicked, I called Elle, telling her I was heading to the hospital, that something was very wrong, and that I had a terrible feeling. She asked me what was happening, but then her voice cut out. Instead, a deep, guttural growl filled my ears. The words were indistinct, but it wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from behind me. I glanced into my rearview mirror just as the darkness took over, my headlights going completely out. The fear was immediate, my heart pounding. But this time, something new happened. A massive hand wove through my hair from behind, fingers so long they reached from the base of my skull to my forehead. I could even feel sharp claws lightly scraping against my skin. Then, suddenly, it yanked my head back against the seat, holding me there. The growling intensified, and the crushing pressure was worse than ever before. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Whatever this thing was, I knew it hated me. It wanted me to be afraid. Then I remembered something Elle had told me. She had taught me a prayer, telling me to call upon God and ask for protection. In sheer desperation, I did. I screamed in my mind for God to help me, promising to believe in Him if He could make it go away. Immediately, the grip on my hair began to weaken, bit by bit, like it was reluctantly letting go. The fear, the static, the crushing weight, it all started to fade. Then I woke up, but the nightmare wasn't over. I sat up quickly, looking toward the loft stairs and the window, and for the first time ever, I saw it, outside of my dreams. The cabin was in complete darkness. No nearby houses, no streetlights, nothing. But right there, staring at me through the second-story chimney window, were two glowing red eyes. They weren't normal eyes. Everything about them was red. Even the whites. I couldn't make out much else, just the outline of a twisted head. But the fact that there was nothing outside for it to stand on, no trees, no ledges, meant whatever it was had to be over 8 feet tall. I grabbed my phone and called Elle, begging her to stay on the line while I told her everything. It was the middle of the night, but thankfully her friend was home, so she could rush back to me. She prayed loudly over the phone, instructing me to burn white sage, and as I did, the oppressive energy in the cabin lifted. By the time she got back, everything felt normal again. After that night, I started going to church with Elle. I prayed regularly, read the Bible, and created my own personal prayer to say before bed. Ever since then, the nightmares have completely stopped. I haven't seen that thing or felt its presence since. My life has improved dramatically. I moved into my own apartment, but I still keep in touch with Elle and continue to pray every night. Some people might call me crazy, might say I imagined it, or that I can't possibly believe that thing was real. But when you come face to face with something evil, something that wants you to know it exists and that it wants to hurt you, you just know. This happened at my family's cabin in rural Saskatchewan, Canada. It was the summer of 2020, and everyone in my family, except for my mother and me, was taking their usual afternoon naps. My mother was out working in the garden, and since I had nothing better to do, I decided to take a walk through the woods. Our property spans around 85 acres, most of which is dense forest. Up until that day, I had never experienced anything unusual out there, so I had no reason to expect what was about to happen. I followed an old, overgrown trail, just enjoying the peacefulness, when I suddenly caught a horrible odor in the air. The only way I could describe it was a mix of rotting flesh and damp earth. Thinking it might be a dead animal nearby, I stepped off the path to investigate. I hadn't gone far when I heard something that made my blood run cold. My younger brother's voice calling me from deeper in the trees. He was telling me to follow him. My heart started racing as I panicked, thinking he must have woken up and wandered too far into the woods. Without a second thought, I rushed toward the voice. I was about 15 meters away when I heard something else. Something massive moving through the undergrowth. Whatever it was far too big to be a small child. Then I heard my brother's voice again, much closer this time. That was enough for me. Fear took over, and I bolted back toward the cabin as fast as I could. The entire time, I could hear something heavy moving behind me, keeping pace, but I refused to turn around, afraid that if I did, I would trip and never make it back. As soon as I reached the edge of the forest, the noises stopped. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to walk across the field and back into the cabin. When I got inside, I found my little brother still sound asleep in his bed, right where he had been the whole time. That's when I knew whatever had been calling me from the woods was not my brother. For the next few days, I stayed away from the trees, too afraid of what might be waiting for me in the shadows. Even now, I hope I never have to experience that kind of terror again. Let this be a warning to anyone who loves exploring the wilderness. Never follow strange voices calling you from the woods. You may not like what you find. During my teenage years, I attended a certain summer camp. One year, I met a girl I'll call Rachel. She was tough, self-assured, and had a bit of an edge to her, but I respected that about her. We ended up in the same cabin that summer, along with a mutual friend. Later, I learned that she was terrified of the dark. At home, she always had a light on when she slept. The night of the incident, a powerful storm rolled in, bringing with it a tornado warning. We ran from the mess hall back to our cabins, the wind and rain pounding against us. The storm was so intense it felt like the wind could carry me away. I had never felt anything like it before or since. That night, after everyone had settled into bed, we were suddenly awakened by someone sobbing, and the cabin lights had gone out. As I lay there, listening to the storm outside, an overwhelming fear gripped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family, far from camp, might also be caught in the storm, but they wouldn't be safe. The lights remained on for the rest of the night. The next morning, Rachel explained what had happened. As she lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep, she saw something lurking in the corner of the room. A massive shadowy figure, so tall its head brushed against the ceiling. Its entire form was pitch black, except for two glowing red eyes. Even now, just thinking about it sends a shiver down my spine. She also claimed to have seen our two camp counselors, but their appearances were horribly twisted. One, a small girl with very long hair, was strung up on the opposite bunk, lifeless. The other had two heads, both grinning. The real counselors tried to soothe her, singing softly and turning the lights back on to calm her down. As a young teen, the whole experience rattled me to my core. I had never encountered anything supernatural before, nor had anyone I knew. And Rachel was the last person to believe in nonsense. She was always logical, always composed. She wasn't the type to make things up, and she definitely wouldn't cry unless something truly terrified her. I believe that what she saw that night were demons, and standing in that corner was the devil himself. It reminded me of my brother. It wanted me to follow from anonymous. My family and I were visiting Kentucky for my parents' anniversary. I was about 7 years old at the time. We had rented a cabin for our stay, and one evening, my dad and I went down to the lake nearby. While he was preparing the boat at the dock, I spotted a deer. Being the curious, animal-loving child I was, I decided to follow it into the trees. I wandered deeper into a shadowy part of the forest, and after a short while, an uneasy feeling crept over me, like I was being watched. More often than not, when I felt that way, it turned out to be true. I turned around, and there it was, the same deer, standing just a few steps away, staring straight at me. But something was terribly wrong. Its eyes weren't like a normal deer's. They looked disturbingly human, except they were glowing red. That eerie sight is burned into my memory. Then I noticed its neck, where the skin looked as if it had been stitched together, holding its head in place. I carefully started sidestepping, trying to move toward the clearing where my dad and the lake were. Yet the deer never broke eye contact. The fear of what might happen if I looked away kept me frozen in place. Desperate to calm myself, I spoke in a trembling voice. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The deer's expression shifted slightly, and I swear it grinned at me. But the most horrifying part? It had teeth, perfect, square, human-like teeth. Then, to my absolute terror, it spoke. "But what if I hurt you?" A chill ran down my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. Right then, I heard a familiar voice, my dad's. I turned to see him running toward me, calling my name. As soon as my dad's voice echoed through the trees, the creature bolted into the darkness. When I looked back, it was gone. My dad grabbed my arm and scolded me for wandering off. I told him I had seen a deer and followed it, but when I described its human-like eyes and eerie smile, his face turned grim. He gripped my hand tightly and told me to forget what I saw and come with him. For a while, I managed to push the memory aside, and we ended up having a great time out on the water. But when we got back to shore, as I was struggling to take off my life vest, I glanced toward the tree line, and there it was again. This time, the deer stood on its hind legs, its jaw hanging open unnaturally, covered in fresh blood. I let out a piercing scream, and the creature bolted back into the woods, running like a human with a twisted, uneven gait. Alarmed, my dad turned to me and asked what was wrong. I could only point in horror as a figure, wrapped in tattered deer hide, disappeared into the trees. I refused to step outside the cabin for the rest of the night. Years later, as I thought back on that night, I decided to research the area where we had stayed. To my shock, I discovered that the land had once belonged to Native American tribes, and what I had seen might have been something terrifying, a skinwalker. Even now, I feel uneasy whenever I see a deer on the road or along a trail. I never go on the hunting trips my dad invites me on, though I feel guilty about it. I just know that if I ever encountered something like that again, I might not be so lucky. I wish I had never followed that thing into the woods. Before I start the story, I need to set the scene a bit. During the events of this story, I was staying at a small cabin, more like a cottage, in British Columbia. The cottage was part of a small community, with 11 others arranged in a semicircle around a communal park. I was 10 years old at the time, and while we were there, my older brother and I became acquainted with a teenager, maybe 15, named Kyle. Kyle was an odd kid, the kind of person who seemed to always disappoint his parents, though I never actually met them. He seemed to avoid them at all costs, even ignoring their calls late at night. As a kid, I couldn't understand why someone wouldn't want to be around their parents, but that was probably because I was pretty well behaved. I never really liked Kyle, but my brother did, and since I idolized my brother back then, I followed him everywhere. Unfortunately, my brother felt the same way about Kyle, so I was stuck with him. Eventually, Kyle decided he wanted to sneak out one night. Naturally, my brother wanted to go too, and since we shared a room, I ended up tagging along. At first, we just hung around the park, but it quickly became clear that we were getting bored. I suggested we just go back to sleep, but the older kids were the ones making the decisions, and Kyle proposed we explore the woods. I protested again, but I was immediately ignored. So into the woods we went, using the faint light from Kyle's phone to guide us. These woods weren't particularly dense. You could even hear the hum of the nearby highway just a few miles away. After a short while, I wanted to turn back, but I had two choices: walk back alone in the dark or stay with them. A few minutes later, I realized something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind. I pointed this out, and we all stopped to listen. After a few moments of eerie stillness, my brother turned to me with an annoyed expression. "Can you be quiet? I'm trying to listen." "What?" I didn't say anything, I protested. "That wheezing, like a sick animal. Keep it down," he snapped. Just as I was about to argue, I heard it too, a heavy, labored breathing. Very quietly, I muttered, "That's not me." Kyle and my brother exchanged glances, and then suddenly, The breathing grew louder, almost excited. We all instinctively looked up. Above us, two glowing orbs swayed in the darkness. They shone an eerie blue, moving side to side, mesmerizing us. Then, the silence shattered with the most unsettling moan I've ever heard in my life. A ragged, rasping wail like a smoker trying to scream while completely out of breath. That was enough to snap us out of our trance. We bolted. Behind us, the sound of snapping branches and shaking trees echoed through the woods. Whatever it was above us, moving swiftly through the canopy. I've never been a fast runner, mostly because of my oversized feet, and I knew I couldn't keep up for long. Pain shot through my legs, and I lagged behind while my brother and Cal pulled ahead, leaving me behind. That thing, whatever it was closing in. Desperate, I did the only thing I could. I dove into a bush to hide. Luck wasn't on my side, though, because the bush I jumped into was covered in thorns. Instantly, my skin was scraped and cut all over. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle my pained cries. Then, I heard something heavy land on the forest floor. From my hiding spot, I watched as the glowing orbs illuminated the small clearing I was in. They weren't lights at all, they were eyes, and they belonged to a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood about 7 feet tall, its skin a sickly dark gray. The flesh clung unnaturally tight to its frame, so much so that I could see its ribs pressing beneath the surface. Its arms were abnormally long, ending in clawed fingers. But the most unsettling part was its chest. Its ribcage looked like it had been pried open. Where a sternum should have been, there was only a dark, pulsating mass, shifting and throbbing with an unnatural rhythm. I couldn't make out its face. Its eyes were too bright, but I knew it had a mouth. The heavy, ragged breathing made that clear. The creature stood still, scanning the clearing, looking for me. I held my breath. After what felt like an eternity, it finally turned and disappeared into the woods. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed in that thorny bush, shaking, until I saw the first light of dawn breaking the horizon. Once the sun was fully up, I forced myself to move. My body ached, my clothes were in tatters, and I was bleeding from dozens of scratches, but none of that mattered. I just ran, ignoring the burning pain in my legs. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I saw a break in the trees. I stumbled forward, emerging onto a busy road. As I took a few steps onto the pavement, my vision blurred, and I collapsed. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. Apparently, someone had seen me stumble out of the woods covered in blood and torn up pajamas and had taken me to the hospital. My parents arrived soon after. When I told them what happened, no one believed me. I kept insisting, but everyone assumed I had simply gotten lost and spent too long in the forest. While I was missing, my brother had made it home safely and didn't tell our parents anything until morning. A search party had been organized, but they got the call to pick me up before they found anything. It's been nearly 8 years since that night, and I've spent countless hours searching for any mention of a creature like that. But I've found nothing. If anyone knows what it could be, I would really appreciate any information.